Alright, so the last video we spent time just creating this scene. This is the default scene. We haven't put anything in it yet. So in this video we're going to create some objects. So we've got our scene and it's called the basics. If you haven't had this, I would definitely check out the video prior to this. And what we'll do is we'll just start creating some things. So we have this scene here and I'm holding Alt and using my 3 mouse buttons to move around in this scene. You can see there's nothing there. You can see a grid and a skybox in the background, the default skybox. So let's go up here to game objects. Oops. Go up to game object and do 3D object, and let's put in a plane first, something to stand on, a ground plane. So click plane, and you can see here that it puts in a plane, and as I explained in the Maya, when we did Maya, it is back face culling here in the game engine. So the front of the face is visible, but from the back side it's invisible. So the normals of the object are always really important when you're working in a game engine. So if I select, out here, you can see the plane has been selected, and now with the inspector window over here on the right, you'll see different pieces of information about this plane. For instance, the position of it, XYZ position, rotation scale, and the name is very important here. So I'm going to go up here to the name first and just create a new name. I'll call this the ground for now. And if we move in here, we can kind of see, this light, this main light, let's select it, is right above the plane, and we could move it if we want to get it out of our way. If we rotate this light, hit E, it'll change, because we're using the default skybox, it'll change the sky as well. So if we get more of an angle like a sunset, then the sky will also reflect that type of look. I'll leave mine at a kind of afternoon sun angle here. Also, this main camera here is really a stagnant camera, and when you select it, you'll see this camera preview come up. This just gives you an idea of what the view of the game would look like if this was the only camera that you were going to be working with it. So you can kind of see as I move it around here what everything looks like. So one thing you have to realize is in Unity, the measurement system is in meters. So in other words, 2 meters would represent about 6 feet. So you have to decide how high do I want this camera to be, and you can see over here in the inspector that it gives you an idea. Right now it's 2.1. I'll just type in 2 in the Y direction, and that puts it roughly 6 feet above the ground. However, if you look at this, it looks like I'm sitting on the ground because the ground plane is actually at 1.5. It's 1.5 meters above the grid, which is at 0. So I'll move this down, and we could probably just type in 0 here. So now I know that this camera is roughly 6 feet above the ground plane, which now when you look at that, you realize this is really not that big of a plane, right? So we can hit R, we can scale it, or we can type in actual dimensions in here. If you say I want this to be a little bit bigger, you could type in exactly, but I'll just scale it, kind of a visual representation of what I want here. Alright, so that's how you can move around and measure and get estimates for how big things are in your world. Alright, so let's go ahead and build a couple other things. So let's go back to the game object menu. We'll go to 3D object again, and let's create a cube. So now we've got a cube, and you can see it's automatically placing shadows based on our light that we have up here, which is kind of like a directional light. If we want to change that, obviously we can rotate that different, and you can see that the shadows and everything will update in real time. So let's go back to this cube. I'm going to select the cube and hit F on the keyboard. It'll zoom right into it, and I'm going to move it so it's sitting directly on the ground. Now this cube comes in at a scale of 1 unit by 1 unit in size. So if you want to make sure it's sitting directly on the ground, go over here to the inspector, and in the y-axis just type in a 0.5, so it puts it right on the 0 axis for the bottom of that. So let's take a look at a few things here. Now we've got some objects. First of all, the cube, I'm going to change, we'll just call it a box. Change the name. And let's create some materials and textures for these pieces that we have in here. So in my assets folder here, I'm going to right click in the project and go to create folder. I'm going to create a material folder so that stores all my materials. So I'll type in materials, and I'm going to right click again and create another folder for textures. So for materials, these will come in with kind of a default material. You'll see down here, if you select one of the objects, it has a default material assigned to it. But let's create some new ones. So let's start with the floor. Let's go into the texture folder, and I included a texture that I bought from a website called GameTextures.com. It's a great site, lots of great PBR textures that you can download. Takes basically an annual membership, and you have access to as many as you can possibly get. So I definitely encourage you to go there and sign up so you can get textures pretty easily. But if you want to just use that one for this little demonstration, that'd be great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in that texture folder and go to import new asset, and then I'm going to browse for that texture file. I put it in the basics folder over here, actually week 14, and it's right here. It's called Metal Modular Bear. So I'm going to bring in this one that ends in ALB, which stands for albedo. Albedo is the same thing as the diffuse or color channel in Maya. It's Unity's basically the color channel. So the albedo map is the one that has all the color information. So we'll select that and hit import. And here it is. At the moment, I'm going to leave the inspector information at its default setting. We may have to make a couple adjustments, but for now we'll just leave it as it is. So we've got a texture in the project now. Okay, when I created that folder inside the project, now that object is part of the project. So I'm going to go back here in the cookie crumbs here where it says assets. That takes me back to the main folder, and I'm going to go into the materials. And now I'm going to right click in the materials folder and go to create material. And I'm going to call this the floor material. So floor underscore MAT just as a short for material. And in here, with the material selected, you'll see all your options. And first thing you'll see under main maps is the albedo. So I'm going to click on this little circle next to albedo, and it brings up your select textures. Now if you've already imported a texture, it should show up here. So there's my metal advanced floor modular bear, and as soon as you select it, it puts it in. So we can just close the box and you'll see it show up on the actual floor. So all we have to do now is take this material and drag it onto the floor object that we have. And I'm going to zoom out, move my camera out, and you'll see that it placed it at a 1-to-1 relationship. So if this floor is huge, then obviously the texture is also going to be huge. So I want to bring that texture size down quite a bit so that it makes sense. It's scaled more to where the real scene is. But remember, it's big because we scaled this floor up. So what we can do is inside the materials here, we can find all kinds of information, including tiling and offset and things like that. So if we want to make this texture smaller, we can just tell it we want to tile it more in both the X and Y directions. So I'm going to start with 20 in both directions. And now you can see that the texture is a little bit more closer to being sized correctly. Now the downside to this is that this is a large area with the same tiled texture over and over, which might be fine, but usually you'd want to break this up a little bit, give it some more variety. But for what we're doing here in this demonstration, I think this is going to be just fine. Now, assuming this texture is kind of a shiny metallic surface, we have some options in here that can replicate that. So you can see down here at the bottom of the inspector, there's specular highlights are turned on and reflections are turned on. But if we really want those to come out, we need to come up here to where it says metallic. And right now metallic is set to 0. So let's increase the metallic to about 0.5. And then also the smoothness is set to 0.5. So the lower you go, the smoother it will be, or the more diffuse it will be. In other words, the reflections, the shininess will kind of diffuse itself across the surface, making it appear rougher. The higher the value, the sharper those reflections and specular highlights will be, making it appear more glossy. So I'm going to go to about 0.75, let's say, on the smoothness. Alright, so that's not too bad. If you really want to see it, you can move around and see where the light glares off of that surface. So let's go ahead and create another material for the cube. So I'm going to go into materials here, I'll right click, create another material. I'll call this the box and MAT, and maybe I'll give it the name so it's green. So this is going to be green. I'm not going to put a texture to this, I'm just going to create a color for it. So in the main maps, instead of looking for a file, let's click on the color swatch and we'll change it to the green that I'm looking for, which may be something like this. And I don't want this one to be shiny, so I'm going to turn off specular highlights and reflections, and that should do the trick on that. Now I can drag this in and drop it on the box, and now we've got some textured assets going on inside our project.